The deed arrived in Joseph Morgan's coat pocket the same morning his wife was buried in the cold Missouri ground, and for 3 months he had not looked at it once. He rode into the New Mexico territory in the spring of 1878, the kind of April that fooled a man into believing the land was gentler than it was. The scrubland stretched out in every direction, pale green and dusty gold, broken by red rock formations that jutted up toward a sky so wide and blue it felt like a judgment. Joseph's horse, a dark roan gelding named Cutter, picked his way along the wagon road with the patience of an animal that had learned not to rush its rider. Joseph had not spoken to another person in 4 days. He had not tried. He was 29 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of face that had once been quick to smile and had since forgotten how. His dark hair needed cutting. His jaw carried a beard he had not intended to grow. He had ridden out of Raton Pass 2 days prior with a saddlebag of jerked beef, a half-empty canteen, and a folded piece of paper in his breast pocket that a lawyer named Everett Hale had pressed into his hands at the close of the worst week of his life. "That land is yours by deed, Joseph," Everett had said, his voice carrying the careful softness of a man managing other men's disasters. "Clara's uncle left it to her, and now it passes to you. It's a small parcel, 160 acres near a town called Soledad in the territory, a water source on the northern edge. You could do something with it." Joseph had folded the deed and put it in his pocket and had not told Everett that the land meant nothing to him, that nothing meant anything to him just then. That he had married Clara Whitmore on a Tuesday afternoon 3 years ago, and had loved her with the uncomplicated fullness of a man who had never expected to be very lucky, and had turned out to be luckier than he deserved, and that she had died of a fever in February before the snow had even finished falling, and that the world had continued on regardless, which struck him as a kind of violence he had not anticipated. He did not say any of that to Everett Hale. He put the deed in his pocket and saddled Cutter and rode west, because there was no direction that hurt less than any other, and west at least had the virtue of novelty. The town of Soledad appeared in the middle distance like something that had grown there accidentally, a cluster of low adobe and wood frame buildings arranged around a wide dirt road that served as the main street. A livery stable anchored the southern end. A general store, a blacksmith, a small church with a cracked bell, a saloon that looked like it had survived 2 floods and a fire. There was a land office which surprised him slightly, and a building with a handwritten sign that read Aldridge Boarding House, clean rooms, fair rates, meals included. Joseph rode in on a Thursday at 4:30 in the afternoon, and the first person who noticed him was a woman hanging wet linen on a line stretched between 2 wooden posts at the side of the boarding house. She was perhaps 25, tall and lean in the way of someone who worked hard and ate sensibly. Her hair was dark brown, worn up, though the heat and the work had pulled several strands loose to curl against her neck. Her dress was practical calico, faded blue, rolled up at the sleeves. She looked at him the way a capable woman looks at an unknown man arriving in her town with complete, unhurried assessment. Joseph touched the brim of his hat. "Afternoon," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he expected, the way a door sounds when it has not been opened in a long time. "Afternoon," she said. She did not stop working. She pinned another sheet and looked at him again briefly. "You passing through or staying?" "Staying," he said, surprising himself. She tilted her head slightly as if she had noted something he had not intended to reveal. "Rooms are $1 a week. Meals are included twice a day. Breakfast at 7, supper at 6. No exceptions because I cook on a schedule. That's fair. Livery is at the south end. Tom Garrett runs it. He's decent with horses if yours needs attention." She glanced at Cutter with the brief expertise of someone who knew animals. "He looks like he could use a rest." "He's had a hard few weeks," Joseph said. Something in the way he said it made her pause, just for a moment. Her hand stilled on the sheet she was holding, and she looked at him, not just at his road-worn clothes or the dust on his hat, but at something else. Something behind his eyes, perhaps, or in the set of his jaw, or the way he sat in the saddle like a man carrying weight that had no physical location. "Emma Aldridge," she said, and offered her name the way people used to offer things out here, plainly and without performance. "Joseph Morgan," he said. "Well, Mr. Morgan, you can put your horse up and come see me about a room. I've got one on the east side that catches the morning light if you like that sort of thing." He did not know whether he liked it or not. He had not paid attention to light in some months. "That'll do fine," he said. He rode Cutter down to Tom Garrett's livery, arranged for boarding and feed, unsaddled the roan himself because it was habit, and because the work of it was one of the few things that still felt steady under his hands. Tom Garrett was a stout man with a red beard and an easy manner, the kind of man who talked to horses as naturally as to people. "Just come through the pass?" Tom asked. "Yes." "Long ride from back east?" "Missouri." Tom nodded like Missouri explained something. "Soledad's not much, but it's steady," he said. "Miss Aldridge runs a good house. Best cooking in the county, though she'll never tell you that herself." Joseph thanked him and walked back up the main street with his saddlebag over one shoulder and his bedroll under his arm. The evening light was turning the dusk gold and the adobe buildings warm. Somewhere in the town, a dog was barking at something that did not seem to merit it. The smell of wood smoke and fry bread drifted from somewhere. Joseph stood still for a moment in the street and breathed, and it was the first time in weeks that breathing had felt like anything other than a mechanical process. He went to see Emma Aldridge about his room. The inside of the boarding house was clean in the way of places tended by someone who understood that order was a form of respect. The main room served as a parlor and dining room both, with a long table capable of seating 8, a stone fireplace, and several mismatched chairs arranged with evident thought. A bookshelf near the window held a collection of volumes that surprised him. Dickens, a surveyor's manual, something in Spanish he could not read from across the room. Emma took his week's payment, showed him to the east room, which was spare and neat with a good quality mattress and a window that looked out on a cottonwood tree and beyond it the open land, and told him that the washroom was at the end of the hall and that she expected men to use it before meals. "I run a civilized house," she said. "I can see that," he said. She nodded once and left him to it. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after she went. He pulled the deed from his breast pocket and looked at it for the first time. It was a standard document, properly stamped and signed, attesting that 160 acres in the Soledad Valley had passed from the estate of one Thomas Whitmore to Clara Morgan née Whitmore, and upon her death, to her husband Joseph Daniel Morgan. The land had a name of sorts locals called the area Drago Creek parcel, according to a handwritten note Everett had attached. The note also said the previous tenant, a man named Arlo Sims, had worked the place as a small cattle operation but had abandoned it 18 months prior when the well went dry. Everett's note ended with, "I believe the spring on the north edge still runs. Worth investigating." Joseph set the deed on the small table beside the bed. He looked at it in the fading afternoon light coming through the east window, the cottonwood leaves moving outside, their shadows rippling across the paper. 160 acres of dry scrubland that a dead woman had inherited from a dead uncle, given to a living man who was not entirely sure he qualified as living anymore. He washed his hands and face and went down to supper. There were 3 other boarders at the table. A pair of brothers named Cal and Denny Prout, who were freighters passing through. Good-natured and loud in the uncomplicated way of men who worked outdoors and slept well. And a quiet older man named Hector Reyes who had lived at the boarding house for 2 years running. Emma explained simply, as if a man living in a boarding house for 2 years required no further explanation. Hector had deep-set eyes and the careful movements of someone living with some persistent pain, and he offered Joseph a nod of straightforward acknowledgement. Emma set food on the table with the efficiency of someone who had done it 1,000 times. Beef stew and corn bread, and a pot of coffee so strong it was nearly a moral position. She sat at the head of the table the way a woman sits when she has built something and knows it, not with arrogance but with the simple surety of ownership. "You're the new man," Cal Prout said to Joseph. "I expect so," Joseph said. "Come far, Missouri." "What brings you out?" Joseph reached for the bread. "Land," he said. "I've got a parcel a few miles out. Drago Creek, I'm told." He noticed, without looking at her directly, that Emma glanced up from her bowl. "Drago Creek parcel," Hector Reyes said in a voice like gravel moved slowly. "That was Arlo Sims' place." "I know it," Joseph said. "Man ran it into the ground," Hector said, not unkindly, just accurately. "Well went dry. He took what cattle were left and headed for Tucson. The deed says there's a spring on the north edge." Hector considered this. "Drago Spring," he said. "There is one. Whether it still runs, I could not say. I haven't ridden out that way in a year or more." "I'll ride out tomorrow and have a look," Joseph said. "The old house is still standing," Emma said. It was the first thing she had said since sitting down, and her voice was even and informational. "Needs work. The roof caved in on the south side last fall, from the looks of it when I rode past in October. But the main structure is adobe, so it didn't fall." Joseph looked at her then. "You rode past it." "I ride out that way sometimes," she said simply, and offered nothing more. He did not push it. He ate his supper and drank 2 cups of the strong coffee, and listened to the Prout brothers argue about the best road into Santa Fe. And later, he sat on the boarding house porch in the full dark and smoked his pipe, which was one of the few things he still did that he had done before. And he looked at the stars over the territory and thought about nothing in particular, which was as close as he could get just then to peace. He rode out to the Drago Creek parcel the next morning before breakfast, telling Emma through the kitchen door that he would be back by noon. She handed him a biscuit wrapped in cloth without comment, and he rode out through the early light with it in his coat pocket next to the deed. The land was rough and beautiful in the indifferent way of land that had been there before people, and would be there long after. The parcel was bounded to the east by a low ridge of red rock, to the west by open scrubland running toward the Soledad River several miles off. The old adobe house sat in the middle of it like something the land had grown tired of supporting, but had not bothered to remove. The south roof had indeed caved, the vigas rotted through, and the adobe facing crumbling below the gap. But the northern rooms were sound, and the main fireplace was intact, and the walls were thick enough to suggest the original builder had known what he was doing even if everything after had been neglect. Joseph stood in the main room with morning light coming through the broken window and the biscuit from Emma's kitchen growing cold in his pocket, and he looked at the ruin of it and felt something he had not expected. He felt the faint, uncomfortable stirring of interest, not in the land itself, exactly. Not in the house, but in the problem of it, in the specific, concrete, answerable nature of the problems in front of him. Roof, well, window, fence. These were things that could be fixed. They had solutions. He walked through every room, stepping over collapsed beams and shattered crockery left behind by Arlo Sims' departure, and he made a mental inventory. He found the spring on the north edge of the property an hour later, a slow seep from the rock face that fed into a shallow basin some previous occupant had walled with flat stones. The spring was running. Not dramatically. It was not the kind of water to build a town on, but it was consistent, clear, cold when he cupped his hands and tasted it. Enough for a house and a kitchen garden and a modest number of animals. He sat by it for a while, listening to the sound of it. Clara would have loved this spring, he thought, and then the grief hit him the way it always did, not gradually but all at once, like walking into a wall in the dark. He sat with it the way he had learned to sit with it, still and quiet, waiting for it to move through him and past him and leave him functional again. It took a while. The spring went on seeping while he waited. He rode back to town and arrived at the boarding house at 20 minutes past noon, later than he had said. Emma was in the kitchen when he came in the back. She did not say anything about him being late. She set a bowl of leftover stew on the table in front of him and poured coffee and went back to whatever she had been doing at the counter, and the kindness of her not mentioning it was so particular and precise that he looked at the back of her head for a moment longer than was strictly appropriate. "The spring runs," he said. She looked over her shoulder. "Good. The house needs significant work. Roof, windows, the south wall needs to be rebuilt. Are you planning to do it yourself?" "Most of it," he said. "I can build, and I can hire labor for what I can't manage alone." She turned back to the counter. "Tom Garrett's nephew is looking for work. He's young, but he's strong and he learns." "I'll speak to him," she nodded. There was a pause, the comfortable kind, the kind that didn't need filling. "The deed," Joseph said, and then stopped. Emma waited. "I haven't looked at it in 3 months," he said, "since I got it. And when I looked at it last night and this morning, it's odd. It still doesn't feel like mine. The land." Emma was quiet for a moment. She turned around and leaned against the counter with her arms loosely crossed, and she looked at him in that way she had, direct and unhurried, as if she had all the time required to understand something properly. "Land takes time," she said. "This isn't Missouri. The territory doesn't give itself to you. You give yourself to it first and then it decides." He looked at her. "And if it doesn't decide in your favor, then you go home," she said simply. "But some people don't have a home to go back to, so they stay regardless and the land takes them in by default." He wasn't sure whether she was talking about him or herself. He didn't ask. He spent the next 2 weeks riding out to the parcel every morning and working until the light went, returning to the boarding house for supper and sleeping the deep, unconscious sleep of a man who has labored his body, past the point where the mind can keep its melancholy active. He hired Tom Garrett's nephew, a 17-year-old named Will Garrett who was built like a young oak and had the cheerful indestructibility of a person who has not yet been damaged in ways that stick. Will was good company in the way of someone who talked steadily about practical things and expected little in return, which suited Joseph exactly. They rebuilt the south roof first, using new vigas hauled from the lumber operation in Cimarron. They reframed the south wall. They dug out and relined the old water cistern to supplement the spring supply. Joseph knew carpentry and masonry from a youth spent on a working farm in Missouri, and the knowledge came back to his hands the way physical knowledge does, without requiring the brain to authorize it. In the evenings at supper, he began to pay attention to Emma Aldridge in a way he initially mistook for simple interest in a capable person. She ran the boarding house with a precision that never felt cold, managing accounts and provisions and the varied demands of transient lodgers with the same practical intelligence she applied to everything. She knew every person in Soledad by name and something specific about each one: their work, their family situation, their capacity for trouble. When a dispute broke out between a traveling merchant and Cal Prude about a card game debt, Emma mediated it at her dining room table with such calm authority that both men left slightly chastened, and the debt was paid without further incident. Joseph watched this and said nothing, because there was nothing necessary to say. He noticed other things. She read every evening after supper, usually for an hour before the light went, sitting close to the lamp with the book held at an angle. She was teaching herself Spanish from a grammar book she kept on the shelf, and he caught her sometimes mouthing words quietly while she worked. She had a garden at the back of the boarding house where she grew herbs and some vegetables, and she tended it in the early morning before the boarders were up. And the care she gave it was quiet and total, the care of someone who understood that growing things required constancy rather than enthusiasm. He found out from Hector Ray's one evening on the porch that Emma had come to Soledad 6 years ago with her father, who had run the boarding house until he died of a heart ailment 3 years back, leaving the business to her. That she had been briefly engaged to a man named Carl Braddock, a rancher's son, but that it had come to nothing. Hector was vague on the specifics and Joseph did not press, and that since then she had run the house alone and seemed to prefer it. "She is not unhappy," Hector said, drawing on his pipe, "but she is careful. You understand the difference." Joseph understood the difference. He was not sure when the thing between himself and Emma shifted from the comfortable working arrangement of landlady and lodger into something that occupied more of his attention than he had allocated for it. It happened in the way these things always happen when two careful people are involved gradually, in the margins, in the unremarkable details. It was the morning she brought him an extra biscuit without being asked, because she had noticed he ate more when he was working hard and said nothing about it, just set it beside his coffee cup. It was the evening he caught her looking at the sky with the particular expression of someone waiting for rain and said, 3 days, maybe 4, without knowing why he thought so, and she looked at him quickly and said, "That's what I think too," and the small shared certainty of it had the warmth of something he had not felt in a long time. It was the afternoon, 3 weeks into his stay, when he came back from the parcel early because a sandstorm had blown up from the south and made work impossible, and he found her in the kitchen wrestling with a stuck cabinet door that had swollen in the heat. He crossed the kitchen without asking and fixed the hinge, which had worked loose from the frame, and when he was done she said, "Thank you," and their hands were briefly close together on the cabinet door, and neither of them moved immediately. She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "I'll put on more coffee," and the moment resolved itself into the ordinary, and Joseph walked out to the porch to sit with the sandstorm rattling the shutters and the dust turning the afternoon orange and brown, and he put his elbows on his knees and looked at his hands, and understood with something between alarm and relief that he was in serious danger of falling in love with Emma Aldridge. He was not sure he had the right to. He was not sure grief gave you the right to anything except the grief itself. But Emma, he was beginning to understand, was the kind of woman who made a man reconsider what he had rights to. The town of Soledad had its own politics, as every small town in the territory did in those years. The Homestead Act of 1862 had brought settlers, and the land conflicts it produced were still playing out with all the friction of competing interests, ranchers, who had grazed open range for years, resenting the fences going up, small homesteaders and farmers trying to make their claims hold against the pressure of larger operations, and the whole tangled question of what the land had been before any of the deeds existed, which was something most people in town discussed carefully or avoided entirely. The largest cattle operation in the valley was the Driscoll Ranch, run by a man named Franklin Driscoll, who was 60 years old, deeply tanned, and conducted business with the easy confidence of someone who had been large enough for a long time to have forgotten that size required justification. Driscoll had used the Drago Creek water source informally since Arlo Sims abandoned the parcel, running cattle through the northeast corner of the land to water at the spring. Joseph encountered this fact approximately 3 weeks after arriving, when he rode out to find 17 head of Driscoll cattle standing around the spring basin he had carefully repaired and refilled. He sat on Cutter and looked at the cattle, which looked back at him with the bovine indifference of animals secure in their habit. He rode back to town and went to the land office, where a thin, methodical man named Ernest Hobart confirmed that the Drago Creek parcel was properly recorded in Joseph Morgan's name, and that no easement or grazing right had been recorded on behalf of any other party. Driscoll's been running cattle through there by informal arrangement with Sims, Ernest Hobart said, shuffling papers with the care of a man who deals in facts and prefers not to deal in their consequences. But there's nothing on record. The land is yours, Mr. Morgan, and you are within your rights. Joseph thanked him and went to find Franklin Driscoll. He found him at the Driscoll Ranch headquarters 4 miles north of town, a substantial operation of weathered buildings and corrals, the whole place bearing the patina of money that had been there long enough to become invisible to its owner. Driscoll was in the yard when Joseph arrived, talking to his foreman, a lean, quiet man named Davis Holt, who looked at Joseph with the evaluating stillness of someone paid to assess incoming trouble. Joseph introduced himself and stated the matter plainly. He was improving the Drago Creek parcel. He needed the spring managed carefully for his own water needs. He was not intending to begrudge any arrangement, but he would need any cattle using the north edge of his land to do so by agreement and within defined limits, and he would need any such arrangement put on paper. Driscoll listened to all of this with the patience of a man who had heard many things said to him that he did not intend to act upon. Arlo Sims was a reasonable man, Driscoll said when Joseph had finished. I'm sure he was, Joseph said. So am I, which is why I'm here talking to you rather than posting the land. Driscoll studied him. There was a long pause that was probably meant to be uncomfortable. I'll need to talk to my lawyer, Driscoll said finally. Whenever you're ready, Joseph said. I'd appreciate hearing from you within the week. He rode back to town. It was not the most comfortable conversation he had ever had, but it had been clear, and clarity was something he could work with. He told Emma about it that evening on the porch. Not because he needed advice exactly, but because he found himself wanting to tell her things. She listened without interrupting, which was something he had come to expect and appreciate. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The night sounds of the territory all around them, crickets, the distant cry of something, a horse moving in the livery down the street. Driscoll doesn't like being told his habits need to change, she said. He's been the largest operation in the valley for 20 years and he's accustomed to the kind of courtesy that's really just deference. Will he make trouble? He might try, she said. He's not a violent man, but he has a lawyer in Santa Fe and he knows how to use the slow machinery of official processes to discourage people. I have a proper deed, Joseph said. I know that, she said. Make sure everyone else knows it too. He looked at her. The lamp inside threw warm light through the window, and the edge of it caught her profile, the set of her jaw, the loose strand of hair at her neck that the evening had pulled free again. You've dealt with him before, Joseph said. A pause. He tried to purchase this property 4 years ago when my father was ill. The price he offered was below value and the timing was not a coincidence. What did you do? I told him the property was not for sale, she said, and I meant it in a way that discouraged any counteroffer. Joseph almost smiled. It was the closest he had come to smiling in months, and it surprised him the way a sound surprises you in a room you believed was silent. Emma noticed. She did not comment on it, but she noticed he could see it in the brief, quiet change in her expression, something opening just slightly like a window turned on its latch. You should ride out to the parcel tomorrow with proper witnesses and pace the boundaries, she said, returning to the practical. Get everything documented. I'll do that, he said. I'll ask Hector to go with you. He knows the land and he's well regarded. You don't have to arrange it for me, he said. I know I don't, she said simply, and there was not an ounce of offense in it, just the uncomplicated truth of a capable woman who was used to arranging things because she was good at it. Hector Reyes rode out with him the next morning, and they spent 4 hours walking and riding the perimeter of the Drago Creek parcel, marking the corner posts that were still standing and noting the ones that needed replacement. Hector knew the land with the intimacy of a man who had been in the territory for 30 years, and he identified features and landmarks with a quiet authority that was worth more than any surveyor's chart. The Navajo called this valley Tsenatiel, Hector said at one point, looking out across the red rock ridge to the east. It means something like the place where the water waits. This whole region was theirs before the government decided otherwise. He said it without bitterness, but also without the apologetic dismissal with which most men offered such statements. These things were done unjustly, he said, and the people are still here, though you would not always know it from the way things are arranged. Joseph listened and said nothing, because there was nothing adequate to say, and Hector did not seem to require him to say anything. Franklin Driscoll's lawyer sent a letter 2 weeks later, a long, careful document suggesting that Driscoll's informal use of the spring constituted a kind of established right under customary usage. Joseph rode to Santa Fe and hired a lawyer of his own, a young Mexican-American man named Alejandro Vasquez who had read law in Austin, and who had a precise and energetic intelligence that Joseph found reassuring. Alejandro dismissed the customary usage argument in a letter of 4 paragraphs that was so thorough and quiet in its demolition that Driscoll's lawyer did not respond for 10 days. And when he did, the response was the preliminary motion of a man deciding whether a fight is worth the cost. Joseph came back from Santa Fe to the boarding house on a Tuesday evening to find Emma on the porch with a book in her lap that she was not reading, looking out at the street with an expression he could not immediately parse. "Something's happened," he said. She looked up. "Cal Pruitt and his brother leave tomorrow morning. I'll have 2 empty rooms by Wednesday and only one prospect, a schoolteacher coming down from Cimarron at the end of the month." She paused. "It's fine. It always evens out." But there was something in her voice that was tired in a way that had nothing to do with the rooms. He sat down in the other chair. "You run this whole place alone," he said. "I have Graciela who cooks with me and does the laundry," she said, "and Tom Garrett's boy does the heavy work when I need him." "That's not what I meant." She looked at him for a moment. "I am aware that I run this place alone," she said carefully. "I'm not made unhappy by it." "I didn't say you were unhappy." Another pause. The street was quiet, the evening air carrying the smell of wood smoke and dry earth. "You said you were here to work the parcel," she said. "How is that going?" He accepted the redirect. "Slowly. The south rooms are livable now. I've got the cistern running well and the spring is reliable. Well, Garrett and I have been fencing the north and east edges. In another month I should be able to bring in a small number of cattle." He paused. "I spoke to a man in Santa Fe about purchasing 10 head of breeding stock. Good shorthorn cattle, it's a beginning." "You're staying then," she said. It was not quite a question. He realized it was not quite settled in his mind before that moment, but that in saying it out loud to her it had somehow become true. "Yes," he said, "I'm staying." She nodded slowly, and he thought, though he was not certain, that she was pleased. She hid it well. But he had been watching Emma Aldridge for 6 weeks and had become attentive to the small vocabulary of her expressions. "Then you should stop boarding here before summer," she said. "Not because you aren't welcome, but you'll want to be on the land and it'll be good for the land to have you there." "Will I still be welcome for supper?" he said, and then felt immediately foolish for asking it that way. She smiled. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, unheld and genuine, and it changed her face entirely, brought warmth into those careful eyes, and Joseph Morgan felt it land somewhere in the center of his chest with a precision that was nearly painful. "Yes," she said, "you will still be welcome for supper." He moved to the parcel in the 2nd week of June. He had the south and main rooms of the adobe house repaired and cleaned. A new-made wooden door hung on proper hinges, the windows filled with real glass he had freighted up from Santa Fe. He had a bed, a table, 2 chairs, a stove, and a set of shelves. He had a corral behind the house and a small barn frame going up. He had 10 shorthorn cattle, 4 of them good breeding cows, grazing in the east pasture on the short but nutritious grama grass that had come up thick after a generous spring. He had, in short, the bones of a life. He came into town 3 times a week, partly for supplies, partly to check in with Alejandro Vasquez about the ongoing correspondence with Driscoll's lawyer, and partly, he was honest enough with himself about it by now, to have supper at the boarding house and sit on the porch afterward with Emma Aldridge. The evenings on the porch became a fixed point in his weeks. They talked about practical things: the land, the water, the cattle, the town's politics, the slow drama of his legal dispute with Driscoll, and gradually, almost without his noticing, they talked about other things too. Books they had read, what they thought about the territory and about the East, and about the kind of people who moved through frontier places and the kind who stayed. Emma had opinions that were specific and carefully considered, and she expressed them with a directness that he had come to find more stimulating than any conversation he had had in years. She had grown up in Kansas, she told him one evening, in a small farming community near Wichita. Her father had been a practical, affectionate man who had brought her west when her mother died of cholera, believing the territory would be a fresh start, which it had been, in the ways that mattered and the ways it was not. "Did you ever want to go back?" Joseph asked. "To Kansas?" She thought about it seriously. "No, this place got into me too quickly. The sky here is different, you've noticed that." "I have," he said. He thought it was the biggest sky he had ever been under, so large it made you aware of your own small footprint in a way that was, somehow, more comforting than diminishing. He told her about Missouri, eventually. About the farm and his family and the years of working and saving and building towards something. He told her about Clara in the way he had not yet been able to tell anyone, not with the heavy formal sadness he deployed for strangers, but plainly as facts that were also feelings. How she had laughed. What she had been like in the mornings. The way she had died, which had been swift and cruel and had left him walking around in the world for months like a man looking for a room he could not find. Emma listened the way she always listened, fully, without comment, without the anxious helpfulness of people who want to fix grief and cannot until he was done. "I'm sorry," she said when he was finished. "She sounds like she was very real." "She was," he said. And then, because it was true and because the evening seemed to require it, I did not expect to feel like myself again. I thought I'd just go on being the ghost of the man I used to be. "And now," Emma said quietly. He looked at her in the lamplight coming from the window, the moths circling the glow, the summer night wide and warm around them. "Now I feel like there might be more to the story," he said. She was looking at her hands in her lap. She said nothing for a long moment. "Joseph," she said, and stopped. He waited. "I need to tell you something about Carl Braddock," she said, "because it's relevant and because I find I don't want to begin anything that has a secret in it." He kept his voice easy. "All right." She told him. Carl Braddock had been a decent enough man, she said, handsome and pleasant, and the kind of man that a practical woman of 22 might reasonably have agreed to marry. They had been engaged for 3 months before Emma had understood, gradually and then all at once, that what Carl Braddock actually wanted was not Emma Aldridge but the boarding house property, which sat on a valuable corner lot and whose well was one of the best in town. "He made an offer to sell to Driscoll the week after the engagement," she said. "He didn't tell me. Driscoll came to me directly with terms, apparently assuming the engagement was the same as a marriage and that I would go along." She paused. "I did not go along. And Braddock, he moved to Albuquerque," she said, 2 weeks after I ended it, which told me what I needed to know about what he had actually been engaged to." Joseph was quiet for a moment. "How long ago?" 3 years, she said. "And you've been running the place alone since." "Yes, and now Driscoll is after my land because he never forgave you for refusing him," Joseph said, understanding suddenly clicking into place. Emma looked at him. "I hadn't said that, but it's true." A pause. "It may be part of it," she said. "He doesn't like being refused things." Joseph looked out at the dark street. "Then we have a common interest beyond good company." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Almost. That's not the most romantic framing I've ever heard." "I'm a little out of practice," he said. She did laugh then, softly, and it was the best sound he had heard in a long time, warm and real in the summer dark. He did not say more than that. He was not ready to say more than that, and he sensed that Emma was not the kind of woman to be rushed toward anything, which made him trust whatever was happening between them in a way he might not have trusted something that moved faster. The dispute with Driscoll came to a head in August. Alejandro Vasquez had built a tight and compelling legal case that Driscoll's so-called customary usage claim was without foundation, and Driscoll's Santa Fe lawyer had effectively conceded this in a private meeting. But Driscoll was a man who did not like to be seen conceding, and so he found a different tactic. He made a formal offer to purchase the Drago Creek parcel outright, at a price that was generous on its face, and included in the offer letter the observation that the land was isolated and difficult for a single man to work without established resources. It was the kind of offer designed to sound like a compliment while functioning as a threat. Joseph read it at the kitchen table of the boarding house, Emma across from him reading her Spanish grammar, and he set it down and explained its contents. Emma listened without expression. "He's trying to make you feel small," she said. "I know what he's doing. Are you going to accept?" He looked at her across the table. "No," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and in her expression he saw something that he recognized, the same stubbornness that had kept her in this house and in this town and in her own life without compromise. He thought it was one of the finest things he had ever seen. He sent a polite refusal to Driscoll's lawyer the same day, through Alejandro's office. Driscoll did not respond immediately. The response, when it came, was not a letter. It was Joseph riding out to his parcel on a Wednesday morning in mid-August to find that someone had cut his north fence in 3 places and run 20 head of Driscoll cattle through the gap, trampling his vegetable garden and drinking the spring basin nearly dry. He sat on Cutter and looked at the damage and felt the slow, cold anger of a man who has been patient and is reaching the end of it. He rode directly to the Driscoll ranch and found Franklin Driscoll in the yard again, and this time he did not speak with the careful diplomacy of a new arrival. "Your cattle have been through my fence," he said. "The damage is real and it is documented. I have had your land and mine surveyed properly. I have a deed, a proper legal claim, and a lawyer who has already established that your customary usage argument is without merit. If your cattle are on my land again, I will be taking this to the federal land office in Santa Fe and filing for damages, and Alejandro Vasquez will make certain that every paper involved in that action is filed correctly and publicly." Davis Holt, the foreman, stood at Driscoll's shoulder with that same still, evaluating look. Franklin Driscoll's face was the complicated red of a man containing an emotion he had not decided what to do with. "Could have been drifters cut that fence," Driscoll said. "Could have been," Joseph said. "But it wasn't." A very long silence. Driscoll said, "I run a large operation. Cattle move." "Then fence your cattle better," Joseph said, and rode away. He expected trouble and got instead, over the next 10 days, a careful and total quiet from Driscoll's direction. No more cattle, no letters. When Joseph saw Driscoll in town a week later, the older man nodded at him with the controlled acknowledgement of someone who has revised their assessment of a situation. Davis Holt stopped Joseph outside the general store the following week. "Mr. Driscoll wants to talk about a water-sharing arrangement," the foreman said. "A formal one. His lawyer will put terms to paper this time." "I'm open to reasonable terms," Joseph said. "My lawyer will review them." Davis Holt nodded. "He's not a bad man," he said. "He's just been the biggest thing out here for a long time." "I understand that," Joseph said. "I don't need to be his enemy." The water-sharing agreement was reached in September. Driscoll's cattle could use the Drago Spring for limited periods twice a week, in exchange for compensation that more than covered Joseph's fencing costs, and an agreement that no further informal use would occur. Alejandro Vasquez drafted it in language that was beautifully specific, and both men signed it, and it was recorded at the land office by Ernest Hobart with the satisfaction of a man who deals in paperwork and regards its resolution as a moral good. Joseph celebrated by riding to town and taking Emma to dinner at the hotel dining room, which was the nearest thing Soledad had to a formal restaurant. He asked her 2 days in advance at breakfast, with the directness he had come to understand she preferred. "I would like to take you to dinner Friday evening," he said, "to the hotel, as thanks for your considerable help and counsel since I arrived." She set down her coffee cup. She looked at him for a moment with the full, unhurried attention she gave everything. "I accept," she said, "although I'll note that you did most of it yourself. You sent Hector out with me the first week," he said, "and you told me to document the boundaries, and you told me not to accept Driscoll's offer. Those were observations, not strategy." "Your observations have been excellent," he said. A pause. Something moved in her expression, not the smile, not quite, but the preparation for it. "Friday," she said, 6 o'clock. He bought a new shirt in Santa Fe on Thursday, which he thought about afterward and decided he was not embarrassed by. The hotel dining room had 8 tables covered in white linen, and a Mexican woman named Señora Fuentes, who cooked with a sophistication that always surprised visitors who assumed frontier cooking was all beans and hardtack. Emma wore a dark green dress he had not seen before, her hair arranged with more formality than her working style, and she looked so entirely herself, and simultaneously so different from the woman hanging laundry on the day he arrived, that Joseph spent the first few minutes of dinner remembering how to conduct a conversation like a normal human being. They talked and talked. They talked through all 4 courses, through the lamb and the corn and the fried sweet pastry that Señora Fuentes brought last with a knowing look. They talked about everything and nothing, the history of the territory, the families in Soledad, a book Emma was reading about the geology of the Colorado Plateau, Joseph's plans for the parcel over the coming year, whether the territory would become a state, and what that would mean for the people already living in it. He told her that he had started to think of the land as his. That the morning he rode out and saw his cattle grazing in the east pasture, he had felt something he had not expected, a simple, uncomplicated satisfaction that had nothing to do with proving anything or escaping anything, just the feeling of a man standing on ground that was his and knowing it and being glad. "The land decided," Emma said. "I suppose it did," he said. She was looking at him across the table, the candlelight between them, the soft noise of the dining room around them. There was no discomfort in her look, no performance, no calculation, just the steady warmth of it, direct and real. "I'm glad you stayed," she said. He set down his fork. "Emma," he said. She waited. "I need to say something clearly," he said, "because I think you prefer clarity." "I do," she said. "I am in love with you," he said. "I have been for some time, and I don't intend to do anything about it precipitously, and I understand that you have good reasons for caution. But I don't want to go on not having said it, so I've said it." The dining room was suddenly very quiet around him, or rather it continued at its own volume, but he was aware of nothing in it. Emma was looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her before. It was not surprise. He did not think he had surprised her. It was something more layered than that, something moving behind those careful eyes, some reckoning that she was doing with herself. She said, "I have not allowed myself to use that word." "I know," he said. "I don't want to be foolish again," she said, and the word again carried the weight of Carl Braddock and everything it had meant, the particular hurt of being wanted for the wrong thing by someone you had chosen to trust. "I know that too," Joseph said. "I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just telling you the truth because you're a person who deserves the truth." She looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly, "I think I am in love with you too. But I am slow with it, Joseph. I need to be slow." "Then we'll be slow," he said. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost relief, almost something else entirely. "All right," she said. They walked back to the boarding house through the warm September night, the stars over Soledad enormous and clear, the packed dirt of the main street pale under the moon. They walked close together without touching and talked about other things, easier things, and when they reached the boarding house steps Emma turned to face him. "Good night, Joseph," she said. "Good night, Emma," he said. He rode out to his parcel in the moonlight because he was too awake to sleep, and he sat on the porch of his rebuilt adobe house and listened to the territory night and felt himself properly, unmistakably, completely himself for the first time since February. October arrived in the New Mexico territory with a change that was dramatic even by the standards of a landscape that did drama naturally. The cottonwoods along the creek beds went gold overnight, or seemed to. The mornings were cold now, the afternoons warm, the air having that extraordinary clarity that comes when summer is fully gone and winter has not yet arrived. Joseph's first small herd was doing well on the grandma grass. He had 4 good breeding cows and 1 bull, and he had reason to expect calves in the spring. He had planted winter wheat in the south field with proper irrigation from the cistern in the spring, and the ground had taken it well. He had a life, he thought, a real one, with roots in the ground and water in the walls and cattle in the east pasture. It still did not feel entirely like his. He was not sure it ever would, the same way a man who has survived a very cold winter carries the memory of the cold even in the warmest July, but it felt real, and real was enough. He came into town on Tuesdays and Fridays now. On Friday evenings he had supper at the boarding house, and afterward he and Emma sat on the porch, or in the parlor when the evenings turned cold, and they talked and were comfortable together in the way of two people who have begun to understand that they are building something. It was slow, as she had asked for, and the slowness suited them both. There were evenings when they sat close on the porch and the conversation stopped, and the silence was not empty but full, and Joseph would look at Emma in the lamplight and feel the patient, steady pressure of everything he felt for her, and she would look back at him and he knew, without her saying it, that she felt it too. He brought her things he thought she would find interesting. A rock formation from the East Ridge that had an unusual crystalline quality, a sheaf of dried desert flowers from the area near the spring, a book he had found in Santa Fe that he thought she would enjoy, a history of the Spanish settlements in the territory written by a priest who had also been an amateur naturalist and kept careful notes on the local birds and plants. She read it over 2 weeks and then gave it back to him with a piece of paper tucked inside on which she had written a list of the birds he had described seeing on the parcel, with notes matching them to the priest's descriptions. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for him in a long time, this precise, careful attention to what he had said and what he had noticed, translated into something useful and shared. He held the list and thought that she saw him. Not the version of him he had been presenting to the world, the competent, functional, forward-moving man working his land and winning his legal dispute, but the actual man underneath, the one still carrying something he could not fully put down, still learning to want things without apology, still figuring out what it meant to be alive in a life that had changed without asking permission. She saw it. She had seen it on the first day, on that very first afternoon when their eyes met over the fresh laundry, and she had paused for just a moment with the sheet in her hands. He rode into town on a Tuesday in November with the intention of asking Emma to come out to the parcel for Sunday to see what he had built. He arrived to find the boarding house in a mild state of disruption. A new boarder had arrived that morning, a woman named Rose Caldwell, who had come from Denver with a 7-year-old daughter named Nora, and a trunk of belongings, and the look of someone who had traveled a long way to escape something, and was not yet sure whether they had escaped it. Emma had given them the largest room, the one at the end of the hall with 2 windows, and was managing the considerable logistical and emotional complexity of a mother and child, arriving with no advance arrangement, with the calm efficiency of someone who had handled stranger things. Joseph helped carry the trunk up the stairs, fed Nora Caldwell a biscuit from the kitchen when the child appeared in the doorway with the wild-eyed look of someone small who has been in a stagecoach too long, and left Emma to it with quiet competence. Later that evening after supper, when Nora was asleep and Rose Caldwell had retired exhausted to their room, Joseph and Emma sat in the parlor near the fire, and Emma told him briefly, without elaborating on details that were not hers to share, that Rose's husband was not a good man and that she had come to the territory to put distance between herself and him. "Will she be safe here?" Joseph asked. "I intend to make sure she is," Emma said. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him. "She needs work, something she can do here in town that pays, and she needs people to be ordinary with her, not to make her situation into something public. She's proud. What can she do? She sews." "Very well, apparently." Emma paused. "Mrs. Harmon at the dry goods store has been looking for someone to take on alterations. I think I'll speak to her tomorrow." "Good," Joseph said. "I shouldn't be making your Tuesday evening about this," Emma said. "You're not making it about anything," he said. "This is what you do. You look out for people." She looked at him steadily. "I look out for my house," she corrected gently. "Yes," he said. "And your house extends rather further than the 4 walls of this building." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said in a different voice, softer, I used to think that was a weakness, this tendency to make other people's difficulties mine. Is it? No, she said. I don't think so anymore. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, which he had not done before. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and neither of them said anything, and the fire made its comfortable sounds. And outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on Soledad, New Mexico, making the world quiet and new. He asked her, after a long and warm silence, whether she would come out to the parcel on Sunday. Yes, she said, without hesitation, and the word landed in him like something he had been waiting for without quite admitting he was waiting. She came on Sunday. Hector Reyes drove her out in the boarding house's small wagon because Emma did not ride, which was a fact that surprised Joseph when she told him, and then, on reflection, did not surprise him at all. She was a woman of specific, particular competences, and riding horses was simply not among the things she had needed. She stood in front of the rebuilt adobe house in the cold November light and looked at it, and then she walked through every room while Joseph stood in the doorway of each one and watched her look at what he had made. She touched the new plaster on the south wall. She stood at the main window and looked out at the east pasture where the cattle were moving slowly through the frost. She looked at the shelf of books and the table and the two chairs and the stove, and everything arranged with the functional simplicity of a man who had built a place to live in rather than a place to impress. She came to the spring on the north edge last, the two of them standing in the cold on the flat stones, the water seeping quiet and clear from the rock face into the basin below. "This is where it all depends," she said. "Yes," he said. "It's good water," she said. "It is," he said. She turned to look at him and the winter light was on her face and she said, "You've done something real here, Joseph," he said. "I want to keep doing it." He paused. "I want to do it with you, Emma. I'm not asking impulsively. I've thought about it carefully. You are the most remarkable person I have met in my life, and the year I have spent in this territory has been better in every way that matters because of your company and your judgment and your company. I know I said company twice, but I mean both instances." He stopped himself. "I'm asking you to marry me, on whatever timeline is right for you." She stood very still. "Joseph," she said, "you don't have to answer today." "I know," she said, "but I want to." She looked at him with those clear, direct eyes that had seen his grief and his useless deed on the first afternoon and had not looked away from either. "Yes," she said. "Yes, on whatever timeline is right." He took both her hands in his. The spring went on moving quietly beside them, the cold air around them carrying the smell of snow coming, the cattle in the east pasture moving the way cattle move in cold weather, steady and purposeful. He looked at her face and she looked at his, and the warmth of it was the warmth of something that had been built carefully and would hold. He kissed her gently in the cold beside the spring, and she kissed him back, and it was everything. They were married in March, in the small church in Soledad with the cracked bell that had gotten the crack fixed over the winter through a collection organized, quietly and without fuss, by Emma herself. Hector Reyes gave her away, which she had asked him to do in such a matter-of-fact way that the old man had needed a moment before responding, and his response, when it came, was simply that he would be honored, said with such sincerity that Emma had squeezed his arm and gone back to being practical before either of them had to acknowledge how much it meant. The whole town came. Soledad was not a large town, but it had the warm communal life of places where people depend on each other in concrete ways, and Emma Aldridge had been a fixture of that community for 6 years. The woman who ran the clean and well-managed boarding house and mediated disputes, and quietly helped people who needed helping, and made the best corn bread in the county. They came for her, and they came for Joseph too, the quiet man who had ridden in from the east with road dust on his hat, and the look of someone who had been through something significant, and who had stayed, and who had built something on the Drago Creek parcel, and resolved his business with Franklin Driscoll like a man who intended to remain. Rose Caldwell, who was by then settled into her work at Mrs. Harmon's dry goods store, and whose daughter Nora had become the unofficial mascot of the boarding house, stood near the back with a quietly pleased expression. Will Garrett stood with his Uncle Tom, both of them scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good clothes. Alejandro Vasquez had ridden up from Santa Fe for the occasion, which touched Joseph in a way he had not expected. Even Franklin Driscoll appeared briefly at the back of the church, which Joseph noticed and which he decided to regard as a form of respect and nothing else, because the man had honored his water agreement to the letter, and in this part of the world that was the most important kind of respect. The ceremony was short and direct, which suited them both. Emma had chosen a prayer by the minister about the particular courage of choosing to build things in difficult ground, which the minister understood to be literal as well as figurative, which it was. When he pronounced them married, and Joseph looked at Emma in her simple cream dress with the cottonwood outside, throwing its early spring light through the church windows, he felt the word home in a way that was different from any other way he had felt it. Not the home of his Missouri childhood, which was a good memory but a closed one. Not the home he had made with Clara, which he would always carry with the complicated tenderness of something true and ended. But this home, new and here, in a territory that had decided to take him in. He kissed her, and the town of Soledad made a sound of uncomplicated pleasure, and Nora Caldwell, from somewhere near the front of the church, said finally, in a 7-year-old voice of perfect clear volume, and the laughter lasted a long time. They held the reception at the boarding house, which Emma had insisted on because it was her place, and she was not going to celebrate somewhere else when she had the best table and the best cook in Soledad. Graciela, who had worked with Emma for 4 years, and who cooked with a genius that Emma had always said she herself could not match, produced a wedding meal of extraordinary quality: roasted lamb, 3 kinds of chili, corn and squash from the previous year's harvest stored in the root cellar, a wedding cake that was a work of architectural ambition for a territory town. Hector Reyes made a toast that was 4 sentences long and said everything. Will Garrett ate more than any other person and apologized for it afterward, which made Emma laugh. Alejandro Vasquez danced with Rose Caldwell to a fiddle played by a man nobody seemed to know but who was excellent at it, and Rose looked, for the first time since arriving in Soledad, as if she was not carrying anything very heavy. Joseph stood on the boarding house porch in the middle of the evening with a cup of cider and looked at the street and the buildings and the sky above them, the territory spring evening wide and violet blue, the first stars coming out, and he thought about the deed in his breast pocket on the day he had arrived useless. He had thought, pointing toward nothing. He thought that grief was like that deed in those first months. Something he carried everywhere that seemed to have no present value, no place it pointed to, no door it opened. Just a weight in the pocket and a loss, and a road going nowhere familiar. He was not sure exactly when the deed had become something real, something that opened into a life rather than a reminder of one that had closed. He thought it was gradual. He thought the land had something to do with it, and the spring, and Will Garrett's cheerful industriousness, and Hector Reyes's patient authority, and Alejandro Vasquez's legal precision, and all of it, and one particular woman on a particular afternoon hanging laundry in the sunlight who had looked at him with eyes that saw both the useless deed and the grief he could not speak, and had not looked away from either. He thought about Clara, too, on this evening, because he was a person who tried to be honest about things. He thought she would have liked Emma. Their particular kinds of intelligence were different, but they would have recognized each other, he thought. He thought she would have been glad for this. He let the thought sit and then gently released it, the way the spring released water, steadily, continuously, without dramatic gestures, just ongoing and real. Emma appeared beside him on the porch, having slipped out from the party. She had a cup of cider too, and she stood next to him and looked at the street and the stars, and after a moment she leaned her head very slightly against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her. "Good party," he said. "Graciela outdid herself," Emma said. "So did you." She was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for asking me," she said. "Not just for the party, for the spring and the asking." He looked at her. "Thank you for saying yes," he said, "to all of it." She smiled, the full smile, the one that changed her face and landed in his chest with that same familiar warmth. They stayed out there a while and watched Soledad settle into its evening, and then they went back inside to their wedding party. The years that followed had the quality of good years, not effortless, because nothing built in difficult ground is effortless, but deep-rooted and richly rewarded. They moved to the parcel together, Emma bringing with her the particular genius for household organization that she had deployed at the boarding house and applying it to the adobe house, which under her attention became properly a home rather than an outpost. She kept the boarding house, hiring a capable older woman named Mrs. Cordova to manage the daily operations, remaining the proprietor and coming into town twice a week. The income from the boarding house gave them financial stability in the years before the cattle operation reached its full production, and both of them understood the value of that. Emma broke the Spanish grammar habit of mouthing words quietly at the counter. Within a year of her moving to the parcel, she was speaking with Graciela, and with their neighbors to the west, a Hispano family named Montoya who had been in the valley for 2 generations, with a fluency that she had built the same way she built everything, patiently and thoroughly. The Montoya family, Juan and his wife Catalina and their 3 sons, became their nearest neighbors and eventually something more than that. Juan Montoya knew the land with the layered intimacy of multiple generations and shared that knowledge generously, teaching Joseph the irrigation techniques that had sustained Spanish settlements through dry years that would have broken Anglo farming practices, and helping him understand the specific character of the soil in different sections of the parcel. The Drago Creek parcel grew. Joseph added 40 more acres in 1880, purchasing a small adjacent claim from a homesteader named Pickens who was returning east, and another 60 acres the following year. The cattle herd expanded to 50 head of shorthorns and then to 100, and by 1881 he had a real operation, small by the standards of the territory's largest ranches but solid, well managed, with good breeding stock, and a reputation for reliable cattle. Franklin Driscoll and Joseph reached a working accommodation that was never warm but was fully functional. The water agreement held. They saw each other at town meetings and stock auctions, and nodded with the mutual respect of men who have tested each other and settled the question. Davis Holt, Driscoll's foreman, stopped Joseph at the stock auction in Santa Fe one year and said simply that Driscoll was getting old and that the ranch would change when he was gone, and Joseph understood this as a communication of some kind, though he was not entirely sure of its precise meaning. He thanked Holt and let it rest. Their first child was born in the autumn of 1879, a boy they named Thomas for Emma's father and for Clara's uncle both, an accounting that seemed right to both of them, carrying forward the names of people who had led, however indirectly, to the spring and the land in this particular evening in September, when Emma held the baby in the lamplight and Joseph sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and the night sounds of the parcel were all around them. Thomas had Joseph's dark hair and Emma's clear, considering eyes, and he was healthy and loud and opinionated in a way that suggested he intended to be both parents simultaneously from the start. "He's going to be trouble," Joseph said, looking at his son. "Good trouble," Emma said. A girl arrived 2 years later in 1881, and they named her Clara, which was Emma's suggestion, and which Joseph received with a fullness of feeling he could not have articulated but did not need to. Clara was lighter in coloring than her brother, with Emma's precise, attentive quality and Joseph's stubbornness, and she was walking before Thomas had stopped knocking himself over, which established a dynamic that persisted for years. Hector Reyes came out to the parcel every Sunday for supper, which had become the standing arrangement after the wedding, and which none of them intended to alter. He sat at their table with the ease of a man who has found his place and the deep, quiet satisfaction of someone who has watched two good people build a good thing and has had some small part in it. His health was variable. The persistent pain in his joints got worse in cold weather, but his mind remained sharp and his company irreplaceable. "The land looks right," he said one Sunday evening in the spring of 1882, sitting on the porch of the adobe house watching Thomas attempt to teach Clara how to throw a stone at a fence post. Her aim was better already, while the cottonwood Joseph had planted the previous year moved in the evening wind. "It looks like it belongs to people who belong to it. We got lucky," Joseph said. Hector shook his head. "Luck is where you arrive," he said. "What happens after is work." Emma, inside at the stove finishing supper, said from through the window without turning, "He's right." "You were listening," Joseph said. "I'm always listening," she said. Hector laughed, a deep, satisfied laugh, and Joseph leaned back in his chair and looked at the evening sky over the territory, vast and clear above the red rock ridge to the east, the light going from gold to rose to the deep particular blue that still, after nearly 5 years, made him aware of the sky as an entity in a way he had never been before coming to this place. He thought of the deed in his coat pocket on the morning he arrived. He had kept it, framed now in the main room of the adobe house between the two windows, under glass, which Emma had done without asking him, had simply appeared with it one day and hung it there and said, "It should be seen, not carried," and he had looked at it on the wall of the house they had built and agreed completely. A deed that had meant nothing on the morning he left Missouri, pressed into his hands by a careful lawyer while the ground above Clara's grave was still fresh, and the whole world had the gray, undifferentiated quality of aftermath. He thought about what it had become. Not just the land, not just the cattle and the buildings and the irrigation channels and the winter wheat. All of that was real and good, but what it had become was more than its acreage. It was Emma and her clear-seeing eyes and her Spanish grammar and her corn bread and her particular way of managing the difficult things of life, not by refusing to feel them, but by meeting them squarely and organizing everything around them into something functional and eventually beautiful. It was Thomas with his dark hair and his opinions, throwing stones at the fence post in the evening light. It was Clara, who had given her small namesake the most important gift she had, without knowing it. It was Hector Reyes's Sunday evenings and Juan Montoya's irrigation, knowledge, and Alejandro Vasquez's 4 precise paragraphs, and Will Garrett's cheerful indestructibility, and Rose Caldwell finding steadiness in a town that had not known her before she needed it. It was Soledad itself, the town he had ridden into on a Thursday afternoon with road dust on his hat and grief he could not speak and a deed that meant nothing, and which had, with the particular generosity of places that are hard and honest and real, decided to take him in. The summer of 1882 brought a drought that tested everyone in the valley. The creek beds ran low. The summer grass burned early. Joseph's cistern and the Drago spring held, and he opened the spring to the Montoya family through the dry months. And Juan Montoya reciprocated the following spring by sending his 2 eldest sons to help with the calving season, which was more work than Joseph, and Will Garrett could efficiently manage alone. The reciprocity of it, the specific, unperformed quality of neighbors helping neighbors in ways that could not be reduced to transaction, moved Joseph in a way he tried once to explain to Emma late one evening. "It's the opposite of what I expected," he said. "When I was young, I thought the frontier was every man alone. All the stories made it sound like isolation was the point." "The stories are wrong," Emma said, lying beside him in the dark, her voice comfortable and certain. "The people who lasted are the ones who figured out that you cannot do it alone. The ones who insisted on being alone mostly didn't last." "You lasted," he said. "Because I made community," she said. "The boarding house wasn't just a business, it was how I stayed connected." "Smart," he said. "Necessary," she said. She paused. "I was lonely sometimes, I won't pretend otherwise." He turned toward her in the dark. "Not anymore." She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, in the voice she used when she meant something completely, "Not anymore." He held her in the dark, the night sounds of the parcel all around them. The cattle settled in the pasture, the cottonwood moving in the warm summer air, the spring seeping quietly on the north edge of the land, and the territory night was enormous and gentle above them, and he was home. The third child came in 1884, another boy they named William, after Will Garrett, who was so thoroughly pleased by this information that he showed up the following Saturday with a cradle he had made himself from the local pine, beautifully constructed for a young man of 23, and stood in the doorway holding it with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that both Emma and Joseph had to disguise their own moved expressions behind practical commentary about the cradle's excellent joinery. William was a tranquil and observant child, different from his siblings in temperament. Thomas had become a determined, energetic boy who had his father's capacity for work and his mother's stubbornness in equal measure, and Clara had developed into a precise, curious, almost scholarly child who had already consumed every book in the house and was beginning to make demands on the Soledad schoolteacher, a patient woman named Miss Trujillo, who found Clara both exhausting and delightful. William watched all of this from his particular calm vantage point, with the equanimity of a youngest child, who has understood that the older ones will provide the noise, and he need not duplicate the effort. Hector Reyes held William at the Sunday supper following his birth, the old man's large, pain-roughened hands cradling the infant with a care that was heartbreaking in its gentleness, and he said something in Spanish that Emma translated quietly for Joseph as approximately, "Another one who belongs to this land." Joseph watched Hector's face as he said it, the deep lines of it and the slow eyes, and he thought that this was the heart of it. This belonging, this continuity, this thread running from Hector Reyes' 30 years in the territory through to this infant who would grow up in the adobe house on the Drago Creek parcel, and know no other landscape as native, who would look at the red rock ridge to the east and the big sky above it, and the spring on the north edge with the particular knowledge of someone born to a place. The thought made him feel the fullness of what had been built so profoundly that he had to go stand outside for a moment, in the evening air, and breathe it through. Emma found him there a few minutes later, the way she always found him when he needed to be found, not searching, exactly, just appearing because she knew him that well by then. She stood beside him, not speaking. The evening was warm, the cottonwood he had planted was now a proper tree, the east pasture full of their cattle, the land stretching out in every direction. "All right," she said. "More than all right," he said. She put her hand in his. "This is a good life," he said. "Yes," she said simply, completely. "It is." He looked at her, at Emma Aldridge, Emma Morgan now, who had stood in the sunlight on that Thursday afternoon with sheets in her hands, and looked at a dusty man on a roan horse with clear, unhurried eyes, who had seen his grief before he named it, and known the deed was useless before he admitted it, who had served him stew, and told him the land would decide and helped him keep what was his and built with him, day by day, year by year. A life that was rooted in hard ground and fed by good water and wide enough under this sky to hold everything, all the grief and the hope and the ordinary, extraordinary work of it. He thought of the deed on the wall between the two windows, not useless now. The most significant piece of paper he owned, not because of what it said, but because of where it had brought him. The road that had led through the worst of everything to this woman's hand in his, this tree in the evening light, these children inside with their different kinds of noise, this land that had decided, this life that was his entirely in every way that mattered. The spring on the north edge went on seeping, as it had for longer than anyone in the valley could remember, the water moving from somewhere deep in the rock into the stone basin and forward into the life of the place, quiet and continuous and absolutely reliable. The way the best things in a life are, not dramatic, not sudden, but constant, real, sufficient, and always, always there. Joseph Morgan had come to the territory with a deed that meant nothing and a grief he could not speak. Emma had seen both without being told, And from that seeing, from that patient and unhurried willingness to look at a man and find what was real in him rather than what was presented, from that clear-eyed generosity of hers that was the bedrock of everything she was and everything she had built, the whole of it had grown: the land, the house, the spring, the children, the Sunday evenings with Hector, the cottonwood in the evening light, the years of honest and loving work, the wide territory sky above it all. He brought her hand to his lips. She leaned against him, warm and steady and entirely herself. Inside, Thomas was explaining something at considerable volume to Clara, who was refuting it with equal conviction. William was likely watching this from his cradle with his particular calm assessment. Hector Reyes was probably still in his chair by the window, his hands warm around a cup of coffee, listening to the family with the deep contentment of a man who has found exactly where he is supposed to be. The evening settled over the Drago Creek parcel like a blessing, unhurried, wide, and given without condition. And Joseph Morgan, standing on the porch of his adobe house on his 160 acres in the New Mexico territory, with his wife beside him and the spring running steady to the north, and the cattle in the east pasture and the whole great territory sky above them, was, at last, and completely, and for all the years that followed, at peace.